my name is Katie Dunn, and my presentation is titled, You Press the Button, We Do the Rest, Kodak, Color, and the Soul of Photography. So this presentation is going to look at the recent development of color photography's popularity as an artistic medium. Specifically, my thesis revolves around how Eastman, or the company Kodak's strategy of outsourcing film development, made color photography widely accessible to amateurs and thereby created a much larger market. However, I also argue that this accessibility led many professionals to dismiss color images as lacking artistic control. So this ultimately led to a pretty big divide between art and culture at the time, which I will explore the evolution of throughout my presentation. First, to better understand how Kodak changed color photography and the effects that it had, it is important to understand why color photography was not that popular to begin with, and what Kodak's model brought that eventually ended up changing that. So, color photography existed long before Kodak, but was always a complex, expensive process. At the time, photography required not only a camera and the film, but also means of developing it, which was a major factor that affected a regular person's ability to attempt or their will to practice photography. So color specifically made this process infinitely harder. One of the most popular strategies for developing color photos during the pre-Kodak era, known as color separation negatives, required separating one image into 3 different negatives filtered in blue, red, and green. They were then made into yellow, cyan, and magenta dyed positives that could be rolled together with perfect alignment to create one single color print, as you can see on the screen. So evidently, this process required not only a lot of equipment, dyes, and triple supplies, but also a considerable amount of precision and time and effort from the person trying to attempt it. So, Kodak, and specifically its Kodachrome color film released in the 1930s, is often credited with launching the quote-unquote modern color boom, but they did not achieve this by making color photography a simpler process. The development process, specifically the K14 method that Kodak undertook for its Kodachrome color film, was still very complex and required multiple chemical baths and very tightly controlled timing during the development process. Again, it wasn't that Kodak changed the chemistry required to do color photography, it was just that the user didn't have to deal with it anymore. The true innovation here was Kodak's business model. Instead of expecting consumers to develop their film at home, they encouraged people to mail it back to Kodak or take it to approved labs and have it developed for them. So the customer experience felt easy, clean, and immediate, since it didn't require people to actually have the equipment or the knowledge necessary to develop the film that they were using. This is where the iconic motto, quote, you press the button, we'll do the rest, end quote, comes from. As Eastman Kodak, the company began to market photography as a casual, everyday activity that anyone could do with this model. So, this revolutionized photography by making it much more widely accessible, opening it up to a pretty large amateur market. They normalized color as a mainstream medium with their Kodachrome film that required no work on the user's part, again opening up to a large market of people who maybe previously had an interest in photography but never had the skills or supplies to do it at the time. So suddenly, vacations, birthdays, and everyday movements or moments could be captured in vibrant color by anyone, not just professionals or advertisers. I found one example online of a man who posted a father, James Brumfield's amateur, untrained photographs of family vacations in the 1950s using the Kodachrome film and the Kodachrome process. You can see those photos on the screen now. So these examples ultimately emphasize how mass accessibility forever changed the cultural function of photography and began to reshape the public's expectations of what photography could and should look like. So, getting to the issue, now we want to look at how professionals reacted to this development. First, I'm going to explore why black and white photography was seen as superior to color photography, and then I'm going to look at what Kodak's method did that caused a lot of professional photographers to respond negatively to that. Okay, so pro photographers often preferred black and white photography, not just because it was less expensive and a lot less effort, but also because it allowed for precise control over the composition of the images they were taking. So Dorothy Lange's work from the 1930s on the screen illustrate this really well. So without color, artists such as herself took many, many different versions of these photos and curated every detail, such as the light, the framing, the facial expression, the contrast, the geometrical shapes or textures, until the final image told a pretty specific story that they wanted to convey. In this case, poverty in America. Black and white helped to control that story with a lot more precision than color did. It was therefore a tool for visual interpretation, not just representation. So this idea that color was less serious and less capable of telling these stories and these messages than black and white film was also echoed by theorists like Roland Barthes, who described color photography as, quote, a coating applied later on to the original truth of the black and white photograph, an artifice, a cosmetic, end quote. So for many, color distracted from the photographer's intentional choices and turned the image into something more so artificial or superficial, more like a makeup than a meaning. In this way, black and white imagery gained a moral and more so artistic superiority over color images. It was for these reasons, combined with the earlier exclusivity of photography, that made some upset by Kodak's introduction of not only a large color market for photography, but also the way that it opened up the medium to many untrained amateurs. So according to Rachel Plotnick, many professional photographers felt relatively threatened by the simple mechanism's invasion of a quote-unquote once skilled craft that used to rely on one's own abilities in composition and development in order to take good images. So a magazine ad for the Photographic Times, seen on the screen, argued that true photographers do not let the company do all of the work for them, really exemplifying the anxiety that established photographers and the photographic industry had that all of their hard work was being devalued by Kodak's new model of this pressing the button and not having to do much else. So the ad's messaging draws a clear line here between the quote-unquote serious photographer who would maintain full control over the image-making process and the casual amateur who merely presses a button and sends the roll away to be developed for them. So while the ad itself does not touch on color photography specifically, it does still kind of hint at this divide between what modernist photography originally stood for and the changing demographics threatening these established photographers at the time. So this sentiment reflects a broader fear that photography was losing its status as a specialized art form and becoming a mass market activity driven more by convenience than by craft. So this led to the divide I've been talking about throughout this presentation, whereby color photography was mostly exclusively an amateur market for a really long time. You can see a photo on the right as more of a typical tourist color photo. This one that I found was from the 80s that someone would have taken on vacation, most likely sent into Kodak or one of their labs to have developed for them and kept as a keepsake. So additionally, color may have been used as an advertisement, but really not often as fine art at this time. Photojournalists and other professionals, such as the works of established photographer Ruth Bernhard, that you can see on the left of the screen, stuck by black and white methods for a pretty long time, even towards the end of the 1900s, just due to this kind of prevailing view that the color works like that on the right were cheapening photography as an art form. Okay, so we've looked at the baseline for color, we've looked at Kodak's model and how both amateurs and pros responded to it, and now I want to look at the legacy of this divide that I've looked at. So I want to explore briefly how attitudes have changed in recent years and how the industry eventually came around to accepting the various forms that photography can now take. So the man often credited with popularizing and sometimes even legitimizing color photography as an art form is William Eggleston. He was known very well for his iconic high chroma saturated hues that sparked a kind of rebellion amongst fine art photographers who were still resistant to recognizing color photography by even the 60s and 70s. So according to Jackie Palumbo, Eggleston's MoMA exhibition in 1976 was the first that actually featured color photography and ultimately became a large factor that led to the acceptance of the method as more so a mainstream. Even more interesting is that his photos were all developed in labs quite similar to the Kodak model, meaning that the quote-unquote pressing a button that many were initially very afraid of slowly fell into obscurity, especially with the digital camera age that slowly took force in the last 20 to 30 years and is now very, very dominant. So now the two methods of black and white or color photography, they coexist a lot nicer with many fine art photographers using both at various times and to achieve varying goals and looks to their images. So in summary, this presentation has argued that Kodak's method of outsourcing film development opened up a color photography market to many amateurs, acting as a catalyst for it becoming a very, very popular art form as it is today. Unfortunately, the pro photographers who were very entrenched in the black and white thinking and black and white photography initially discounted color photography and were pretty resistant to this change, leading to a pretty big cultural divide in the mid to late 1900s in the photographic industry that saw color photography become much more of a taboo until eventually becoming popularized more so by Eggleston. Today, color photography is widely embraced as a powerful artistic medium, valued for its ability to tell complex, nuanced stories just as profoundly as black and white ever did. I want to thank you so much for listening, and thanks very much for a really great course. Thank you.